It's 2017 and Old Time Radio DVD is still here. Check out our new customer ownership program and the lowest prices ever. Just go to oldtimeradiodvd.com for full information about this wonderful program. Don't forget our new program, 123 Ready TV. Folks, this is really a great app for Android and Windows phones, computers, and tablets. And it's only $19.99. In the near future, we will be adding a new component to it, Old Time Radio. It's a great product for 2017. Visit oldtimeradiodvd.com today. Place your order. You'll be glad you did.
The last drops of the thunder shower had hardly ceased falling when the pedestrian stuffed his map into his pocket, settled his pack more comfortably on his tired shoulders, and stepped out from the shelter of a large chestnut tree into the middle of the road. Every tree and blade of grass was dripping, and the road shone like a river. If he had chosen to look back, which he did not, he could have seen the spire of Much Nadaby, and, seeing it, might have uttered a malediction on the inhospitable little hotel which, though obviously empty, had refused him a bed. His only chance now was Stirk on the far side of the hills, and a good 6 miles away. He walked fairly fast and doggedly, without looking much about him, like a man trying to shorten the way with some interesting train of thought. He was tall, but a little round-shouldered, about 35 to 40 years of age, and dressed with that particular kind of shabbiness which marks a member of the intelligentsia on holiday. In fact, he was a philologist and fellow of a Cambridge college. His name was Ransom. He had hoped when he left Nadaby that he might find a night's lodging at some friendly farm before he had walked as far as Stirk. But the land this side of the hill seemed almost uninhabited. It was a desolate, featureless sort of country, mainly devoted to cabbage and turnip, with poor hedges and few trees. As the evening drew in and the noise of the birds came to an end, it grew more silent than an English landscape usually is. The noise of his own feet on the metal road became irritating. He had walked thus for a matter of 2 miles when he became aware of a light ahead, which proved to be from a very small cottage. A woman darted out of the open doorway as he approached it and almost collided with him.
"Oh, I beg your pardon, sir," she said. "I thought it was my Harry."
Ransom asked her if there was any place nearer than Stirk where he might possibly get a bed.
"No, sir," said the woman. "Not nearer than Stirk. I dare say as they might fix you up at Nadaby."
Ransom explained that he'd already tried Nadaby.
"Oh, then I don't know, I'm sure, sir," she replied. "There isn't hardly any house before Stirk, not what you want. There's only the Rise where my Harry works, and I thought you was coming from that place, sir, and that's why I come out when I heard you, thinking it might be him. You ought to be home this long time."
"The Rise," said Ransom. "What's that? A farm? Would they put me up?"
"Oh, no, sir. You see, there's no one there now except the professor and the gentleman from London. They wouldn't do anything like that, sir. They don't even keep any servants except my Harry for doing the furnace like, and he's not in the house."
"What's this professor's name?" asked Ransom with a faint hope.
I don't know, I'm sure, sir. The other gentleman's Mr. Devine, he is, and Harry says the other gentleman is a professor. He don't know much about it, you see, sir, being a little simple, and that's why I don't like him coming home so late, and they said they'd always send him home at 6 o'clock.
Ransom perceived that she was trembling and nearly crying. It occurred to him that he ought to call on the mysterious professor and ask for the boy to be sent home. And it occurred to him, just a fraction of a second later, that once he were inside the house, among men of his own profession, he might very reasonably accept the offer of a night's hospitality. He told the woman what he intended to do. "Oh, thank you very much, sir, I'm sure," she said. "And if you would be so kind as to see Harry out the gate and on the road before you leave, if you see what I mean, sir." Ransom reassured her as well as he could and ascertained that he would find the Rise on his left in about 5 minutes. There was no sign of any light on the left of the road, nothing but the flat fields and a mass of darkness which he took to be a copse. It seemed more than 5 minutes before he reached it and found that he had been mistaken. It was divided from the road by a good hedge, and in the hedge was a white gate. Ransom tried the gate and found it locked. He stood for a moment undecided, discouraged by the silence and the growing darkness. He knew that it would be possible, if one really wanted, to force a way through the hedge. He did not want to. A nice fool he would look, blundering in upon some retired eccentric, the sort of man who kept his gates locked in the country, with this silly story of a hysterical mother in tears because her idiot boy had been kept half an hour late at his work. Yet it was perfectly clear that he would have to get in, and since one cannot crawl through a hedge with a pack on, he slipped his pack off and flung it over the gate. The moment he had done so, it seemed to him that he had not till now fully made up his mind, now that he must break into the garden, if only in order to recover the pack. He became very angry with the woman and with himself, but he got down on his hands and knees and began to worm his way into the hedge. The operation proved more difficult than he had expected, and it was several minutes before he stood up in the wet darkness on the inner side of the hedge, smarting from his contact with thorns and nettles. He groped his way to the gate, picked up his pack, and then for the first time turned to take stock of his surroundings. The house itself showed no light. Some of the windows were shuttered, some gaped black without shutter or curtain, but all were lifeless and inhospitable. The only sign of occupation was a column of smoke that rose from behind the house with a density which suggested the chimney of a factory, or at least of a laundry, rather than that of a kitchen. The rise was clearly the last place in the world where a stranger was likely to be asked to stay the night, and Ransom would certainly have turned away if he had not been bound by his unfortunate promise. He mounted the 3 steps which led into the deep porch, rang the bell, and waited. After a time, he rang the bell again and sat down on a wooden bench which ran along one side of the porch. He was very tired by now, and it was perhaps this which prevented him from rising and ringing the 3rd time. This and the soothing stillness of the garden, beauty of the summer sky, and the occasional hooting of an owl somewhere in the neighborhood, which seemed only to emphasize the underlying tranquility of his surroundings. Something like drowsiness had already descended upon him when he found himself startled into vigilance. A peculiar noise was going on, a scuffling noise, vaguely reminiscent of a football scrum. He stood up. The noise was unmistakable by now. People with boots on were fighting or wrestling. They were shouting, too. He could not make out the words, but he heard the monosyllabic barking ejaculations of men who were angry and out of breath. And the last thing Ransom wanted was an adventure, but a conviction that he ought to investigate the matter was already growing upon him when a much louder cry rang out in which he could distinguish the words, "Let me go! Let me go!" And then a second later, "I'm not going in there! Let me go home!" Throwing off his pack, Ransom sprang down the steps of the porch and ran round to the back of the house as quickly as his stiff and footsore condition allowed him. The ruts and pools of the muddy path led into what seemed to be a yard, but a yard surrounded with an unusual number of outhouses. He had a momentary vision of a tall chimney, a low door filled with red firelight, and a huge round shape that rose black against the stars, which he took for the dome of a small observatory. Then all this was blotted out of his mind by the figures of 3 men who were struggling together so close to him that he almost cannoned into them. From the very first, Ransom felt no doubt that the central figure, whom the 2 others seemed to be detaining in spite of his struggles, was the woman's son, Harry. He would like to have thundered out, "What are you doing to that boy?" But the words that actually came, in rather an unimpressive voice, were, "Here, I say." The 3 combatants fell suddenly apart, the boy blubbering. "May I ask," said the thicker and taller of the 2 men, "who the devil you may be and what you're doing here?" "I'm on a walking tour," said Ransom, "and I promised a poor woman—" "Poor woman be damned! How did you get in?" Through the hedge," said Ransom. "We ought to have a dog in this place," said the thick man to his companion. "You mean we would have a dog if you hadn't insisted on using tartar for an experiment?" said the man who had not yet spoken. He was nearly as tall as the other, but slender and apparently the younger of the 2, and his voice sounded vaguely familiar. "Look here," said Ransom, I don't know what you're doing to that boy, but it's long after hours, and it's high time you sent him home. I haven't the least wish to interfere in your private affairs, but—" "Who are you?" roared the thick man. My name is Ransom, if that is what you mean, and—" "By Jove," said the slender man. "Not Ransom, who used to be at Wedenshaw." "I was at school at Wedenshaw," said Ransom. "I thought I knew you as soon as you spoke," said the slender man. "I'm Devine. Don't you remember me?" "Oh, of course, I should think I do," said Ransom as the 2 men shook hands with the rather laboured cordiality which is traditional in such meetings. In actual fact, Ransom had disliked Devine at school as much as anyone he could remember. "You don't know Weston, perhaps?" Devine indicated his massive and loud-voiced companion. "The Weston," he added. "You know, the great physicist? Weston, allow me to introduce my old schoolfellow, Ransom. Dr. Elwyn Ransom." The Ransom, you know. The great philologist. I know nothing about it, said Weston, who was still holding the unfortunate Harry by the collar. And if you expect me to say that I'm pleased to see this person who has just broken into my garden, you'll be disappointed. I want to know what he's doing here, and after that I want to see the last of him. Don't be an ass, Weston, said Devine in a more serious voice. His dropping in is delightfully apropos. You mustn't mind Weston's little way, Ransom. Conceals a general's heart beneath a grim exterior, you know. Oh, you'll come in and have a drink and something to eat, of course. Oh, that's very kind of you, said Ransom. But about the boy... Devine drew Ransom aside. Balmy. Works like a beaver as a rule, but gets these fits. We're only trying to get him into the wash house and keep him quiet for an hour or so until he's normal again. Well, you can take him home yourself presently if you like, and come back and sleep here. Ransom was very much perplexed. There was something about the whole scene suspicious enough and disagreeable enough to convince him that he had blundered on something criminal, while on the other hand he had all the deep, irrational conviction of his age and class that such things could never cross the path of an ordinary person except in fiction. Even if they had been ill-treating the boy, Ransom did not see much chance of getting him away from them by force. While these thoughts were passing through his head, Devine had been speaking to Weston in a low voice, but no lower than was to be expected of a man discussing hospitable arrangements in the presence of a guest. It ended with a grunt of assent from Weston. And then Weston spoke to the boy. You've given enough trouble one night, Harry, he said. In a properly governed country, I'd know how to deal with you. Now hold your tongue and stop snivelling. You needn't go to the wash-house if you don't want to.
It wasn't a wash-house,
sobbed the half-wit.
You know it weren't. I don't want to go in that thing again.
He means the laboratory, interrupted. It puts the wind up him for some reason. He turned to the boy. Now listen, Harry, this kind gentleman is going to take you home as soon as he's had a rest. Now, if you'll come in and sit down quietly in the hall, I'll give you something you like. He imitated the noise of a cork being drawn from a bottle. Ransom remembered it had been one of Devine's tricks at school, and a guffaw of infantile knowingness broke from Harry's lips. Bring him in, said Weston, as he turned away and disappeared into the house. Ransom hesitated to follow, but Devine assured him that Weston would be very glad to see him. The lie was barefaced, but Ransom's desire for a rest and a drink were rapidly overcoming his social scruples. Preceded by Devine and Harry, he entered the house and found himself a moment later seated in an armchair and awaiting the return of Devine, who had gone to fetch refreshments. His host seemed to be a long time away, and Ransom fell to thinking of Devine. He felt for him that sort of distaste we feel for someone whom we have admired in boyhood for a very brief period and then outgrown. Before he left Wedenshaw, Ransom had already begun to find Devine a bore, and at Cambridge he had avoided him, wondering from afar how anyone so flashy and, as it were, ready-made could be so successful. Then had come the mystery of Devine's election to the Leicester College Fellowship, and the further mystery of his increasing wealth. He had long since abandoned Cambridge for London, and was presumably something in the city. As far as Ransom could gather from their brief conversation in the yard, his old schoolfellow had altered very little. Ransom's thoughts were interrupted by the opening of the door. Devine entered alone, carrying a bottle of whiskey on a tray with glasses and a siphon. Weston is looking out something to eat, he said as he placed the tray on the floor beside Ransom's chair and addressed himself to opening the bottle. Ransom, who was very thirsty indeed by now, observed that his host was one of those irritating people who forget to use their hands when they begin talking. Devine started to prise up the silver paper which covered the cork, and then stopped. How do you come to be in this benighted part of the country? I'm on a walking tour, said Ransom. God, exclaimed Devine. Do you do it for money, or is it sheer masochism? Pleasure, of course, said Ransom, keeping his eye immovably on the still unopened bottle. Can the attraction of it be explained to the uninitiate? Asked Devine. I hardly know. To begin with, I like the actual walking. You see, on a walking tour, you're absolutely detached. You stop where you like and go on where you like. As long as it lasts, you need consider no one and consult no one but yourself. Until one night you find a wire waiting at your hotel saying, "Come back at once," replied Devine, at last removing the silver paper. Well, only if you were fool enough to leave a list of addresses and go to them. The worst that could happen to me would be that man on the wireless saying, will Dr. Elwyn Ransom, believed to be walking somewhere in the Midlands... I begin to see the idea, said Devine, pausing in the very act of drawing the cork. It wouldn't do if you were in business. You are a lucky devil. But can even you just disappear like that? I mean, no wife, no young, no aged but honest parent or anything of that sort? Only a married sister in India. And then, you see, I'm a Don. And a Don in the middle of a long vacation is almost a non-existent creature, as you ought to remember. College neither knows nor cares where he is, and certainly no one else does. Cork at last came out of the bottle with a heart-cheering noise. Say when, said Devine, as Ransom held out his glass. But I feel sure there's a catch somewhere. I mean, do you really mean to say that no one knows where you are or when you ought to get back and no one can get hold of you? Ransom was nodding in reply when Devine, who had picked up the siphon, suddenly swore. Oh, I'm afraid this is empty. Do you mind having water? I'll have to get some from the scullery. How much do you like? Oh, fill it up, please, said Ransom. A few minutes later, Devine returned and handed Ransom his long-delayed drink. As he put down the half-emptied tumbler with a sigh of satisfaction, Ransom remarked that Devine's choice of residence was at least as odd as his own choice of holiday. Quite, said Devine. But if you knew Weston, you'd realize that it's much less trouble to go where he wants than to argue the matter. What you call a strong colleague. Colleague? Said Ransom. In a sense. Devine glanced at the door and drew his chair closer to Ransom's. He's the goods all right, though. Between ourselves, I'm putting a little money into some experiments he has on hand. It's all straight stuff. In the march of progress and the good of humanity and all that. But it has an industrial side. While Devine was speaking, something odd began to happen to Ransom. At first, it merely seemed to him that Devine's words were no longer making sense. Then, as Ransom tried to move in his chair, he found that he had lost all power over his own body. He felt quite comfortable, but it was as if his legs and arms had been bandaged to the chair and his head gripped in a vice, a beautifully padded but quite immovable vice. He did not feel afraid, though he knew that he ought to be afraid, and soon would be. Then, very gradually, the room faded from his sight. Ransom could never be sure whether what followed had any bearings on the events recorded in this book, or whether it was merely an irresponsible dream. It seemed to him that he and Weston and Devine were all standing in a little garden surrounded by a wall. The garden was bright and sunlit, but over the top of the wall you could see nothing but darkness. They were trying to climb over the wall, and Weston asked them to give him a hoist up. Ransom kept on telling him not to go over the wall because it was so dark on the other side, but Weston insisted, and all three of them set about doing so. Ransom was the last. He got astride on the top of the wall, sitting on his coat because of the broken bottles. The other two had already dropped down on the outside into the darkness, but before he followed them, a door in the wall, which none of them had noticed, was opened from without, and the queerest people he had ever seen came into the garden, bringing Weston and Devine back with them. They left him in the garden and retired into the darkness themselves, locking the door behind them. Ransom found it impossible to get down from the wall. He remained sitting there, not frightened, but rather uncomfortable, because his right leg, which was on the outside, felt so dark, and his left leg felt so light. "My leg will drop off if it gets much darker," he said. Then he looked down into the darkness and asked, "Who are you?" And the queer people must still have been there, for they all replied, "Whoo, whoo, whoo," just like owls. He began to realize that his leg was not so much dark as cold and stiff, because he had been resting the other on it for so long, and also that he was in an armchair in a lighted room. A conversation was going on near him, and had, he now realized, been going on for some time. His head was comparatively clear. He realized that he'd been drugged or hypnotized or both, and he felt that some control over his own body was returning to him, though he was still very weak. He listened intently, without trying to move. "I'm getting a little tired of this, Weston," Devine was saying, "and especially as it's my money that's being risked. I tell you, he'll do quite as well as the boy, and in some ways better. Only he'll be coming round very soon now, and we must get him aboard at once. We ought to have done it an hour ago." "The boy was ideal," said Weston sulkily. The sort of boy who in a civilized community would be automatically handed over to the state laboratory for experimental purposes. I dare say, but in England he's the sort of boy in whom Scotland Yard might conceivably feel an interest. This busybody, on the other hand, will not be missed for months. And even then, no one will know where he was when he disappeared. He came alone. He left no address. He has no family. And finally, he's poked his nose into the whole affair of his own accord. Well, I confess I don't like it. He is, after all, human. The boy was really almost a preparation. Still, he's only an individual, and probably a quite useless one. We're risking our own lives, too. In a great cause. Oh, for the Lord's sake, don't start all that stuff now. We haven't time. I dare say, replied Weston, he would consent if he could be made to understand. Take his feet, and I'll take his head, said Devine. If you really think he's coming round, said Weston, you'd better give him another dose. We can't start till we get the sunlight. It wouldn't be pleasant having him struggling in there for 3 hours or so. It would be better if he didn't wake up until we were underway. True enough. Just keep an eye on him while I run upstairs and get another dose. Devine left the room. Ransom saw through his half-closed eyes that Weston was standing over him. He had no means of foretelling how his own body would respond, if it responded at all, to a sudden attempt of movement. But he saw at once that he must take his chance. Almost before Devine had closed the door, Ransom flung himself with all his force at Weston's feet. The scientist fell forward across the chair, and Ransom, flinging him off with an agonizing effort, rose and dashed into the hall. He was very weak, and fell as he entered it, but terror was behind him. In a couple of seconds, he had found the hall door and was working desperately to master the bolts. Darkness and his trembling hands were against him. Before he had drawn one bolt, booted feet were clattering over the carpetless floor behind him. He was gripped by the shoulders and the knees. Kicking, writhing, dripping with sweat, and bellowing as loud as he could in the faint hope of rescue, he prolonged the struggle with a violence of which he would have believed himself incapable. For one glorious moment, the door was open. The fresh night air was in his face. He saw the reassuring stars and even his own pack lying in the porch. Then a heavy blow fell on his head. Consciousness faded, and the last thing of which he was aware was the grip of strong hands pulling him back into the dark passage, and the sound of a closing door. Ransom's peaceful walking holiday in the Midlands had led him by chance to a house where he was overpowered and kept prisoner by 2 men engaged in some sinister scientific experiment. He'd been knocked unconscious when he tried to escape. When Ransom came to his senses, he seemed to be in bed in a dark room. He had a pretty severe headache, and this, combined with a general lassitude, discouraged him at first from attempting to rise or to take stock of his surroundings. He noticed, drawing his hand across his forehead, that he was sweating freely, and this directed his attention to the fact that the room, if it was a room, was remarkably warm. Moving his arms to fling off the bedclothes, he touched a wall at the right side of the bed. It was not only warm, but hot. He moved his left hand to and fro in the emptiness on the other side, and noticed that there the air was cooler. Apparently the heat was coming from the wall. He felt his face and found a bruise over the left eye. This recalled to his mind the struggle with the 2 men, Weston and Devine, and he instantly concluded that they had put him in an outhouse behind their furnace. At the same time, he looked up and recognized the source of the dim light in which, without noticing it, he had all along been able to see the movements of his own hands. There was some kind of skylight immediately over his head, a square of night sky filled with stars. It seemed to Ransom that he had never looked out on such a frosty night. Pulsing with brightness as with some unbearable pain or pleasure, clustered in pathless and countless multitudes, dreamlike in clarity, blazing in perfect blackness, the stars seized all his attention, troubled him, excited him, and drew him up to a sitting position. Some minutes later, the orb of the full moon was pushing its way into the field of vision. Ransom sat still and watched. He had never seen such a moon, so white, so blinding and so large. Like a great football just outside the glass, he thought, and then a moment later, no, it's bigger than that. The light of the huge moon, if it was a moon, had by now illuminated his surroundings almost as clearly as if it were day. It was a very strange room. The floor was so small, the bed and table beside it occupied the whole width of it. The ceiling seemed to be nearly twice as wide, and the walls sloped outward as they rose, so that Ransom had the impression of lying at the bottom of a deep and narrow wheelbarrow. He was now recovering rapidly and even beginning to feel an unnatural lightness of heart and a not disagreeable excitement. The heat was still oppressive, and he stripped off everything but his shirt and trousers before rising to explore. Although he had been conscious of no unusual muscular effort, he found himself leaping from the bed with an energy which brought his head into sharp contact with the skylight and flung him down again in a heap on the floor. He found himself on the other side against a wall, the wall that ought to have sloped outwards like the side of a wheelbarrow, according to his previous reconnaissance. But it didn't. He felt it and looked at it. It was unmistakably at right angles to the floor. More cautiously this time, he rose again to his feet. He felt an extraordinary lightness of body. It was with difficulty that he kept his feet on the floor. The room was walled and floored with metal, and was in a state of continuous, faint vibration, a silent vibration with a strangely lifelike and unmechanical quality about it. But if the vibration was silent, there was plenty of noise going on, a series of musical raps or percussions at quite irregular intervals which seemed to come from the ceiling. It was as if the metal chamber in which he found himself was being bombarded with small, tinkling missiles. He knew now that he was not in a house, but in some moving vessel. Puzzled, he sat down again on the bed and stared at the portentous moon. An airship. Some kind of flying machine. But why did the moon look so big? A thought came into his head which stopped his breath. There could be no full moon at all that night. He remembered distinctly that he had walked from Natterby in a moonless night. The thing wasn't the moon at all. But he felt the hair move on his scalp. At that moment, the sound of an opening door made him turn his head. An oblong of dazzling light appeared behind him and instantly vanished as the door closed again, having admitted the bulky form of a naked man whom Ransom recognized as Weston, the man Devine had introduced as the great physicist. No reproach, no demand for an explanation rose to Ransom's lips or even to his mind, not with that monstrous orb above them. The mere presence of a human being with its offer of at least some companionship broke down the tension in which his nerves had long been resisting a bottomless dismay. Weston, he gasped. What is it? It's not the moon, not that size. It can't be, can it? No, replied Weston. It's the Earth. Ransom's legs failed him, and he must have sunk back upon the bed. You can't mean that, he said. Certainly. Then where are we? Standing out from Earth about 85,000 miles. You mean we're in space? Weston nodded. What for? Said Ransom. And what on earth have you kidnapped me for? And how have you done it? For a moment, Weston seemed disposed to give no answer. He sat down on the bed beside Ransom. As to how we do it? I suppose you mean how the spaceship works. Well, it's no good your asking that. It makes you happy to repeat words that don't mean anything, which is, in fact, what unscientific people want when they ask for an explanation. You may say we work by exploiting the less observed properties of solar radiation. As to why we are here, we are on our way to Malacandra. Do you mean a star called Malacandra? Well, even you can hardly suppose we are going out of the solar system. Malacandra is much nearer than that. We shall make it in about 28 days. There isn't a planet called Malacandra, objected Ransom. I'm giving it its real name, not the name invented by terrestrial astronomers, said Weston. But surely this is nonsense, said Ransom. How the deuce did you find out its real name, as you call it? From the inhabitants. Do you mean to tell me you claim to have been to this star before, or this planet, or whatever it is? Yes? You can't really ask me to believe that, said Ransom. Damn it all, it's not an everyday affair. Why has no one heard of it? Or why has it not been in all the papers? Because we are not perfect idiots, said Weston gruffly. And you say this place is inhabited? Weston gave him a peculiar look and then nodded. And what has all this to do with me? You've assaulted me, drugged me, and you've apparently carried me off as a prisoner in this infernal thing. What have I done to you? What do you say for yourself? I might reply by asking you why you crept into my backyard like a thief. If you'd minded your own business, you would not be here. As it is, I admit that we have had to infringe your rights. My only defense is that small claims must give way to great. As far as we know, we are doing what has never been done in the history of man, perhaps never in the history of the universe.
We have learned how to jump off the speck of matter on which our species began. Infinity, and therefore perhaps eternity, is being put into the hands of the human race. You cannot be so small-minded as to think that the rights or the life of an individual or of a million individuals are of the slightest importance in comparison with this.